Hi guys! We are back again with The Borrowers, written by Mary Norton, and we are officially up to chapter 19. There's only one more chapter after this, can you believe it? I feel like this has gone by so fast. Oh my gosh. I can't wait to see what happens next. Are you excited too? I know I am. Alright, let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 19. And that, said Mrs. May, laying down her crochet hook, is really the end. Kate stared at her. "Oh, it can't be," she gasped. "Oh, please, please." "The last square," said Mrs. May, smoothing it out on her knee. "The 150th. Now we can sew them together." "Oh," said Kate, breathing again, "the quilt. I thought you meant the story." "It's the end of the story, too," said Mrs. May absently. "Or the beginning. He never saw them again." And she began to sort out the squares. "But," stammered Kate, "you can't, it's not fair," she cried. "It's cheating. It's—" Tears sprang to her eyes. She threw her work down on the table and her crochet hook after it, and she kicked the bag of wools which lay beside her on the carpet. "Why, Kate, why?" Mrs. May looked genuinely surprised. "Something more must have happened," cried Kate, angrily. "What about the rat-catcher, and the policeman, and the—" "But something more did happen," said Mrs. May. "A lot more happened. I'm going to tell you." "Then why did you say it was the end?" "Because," said Mrs. May. She still looked surprised. "He never saw them again." "Then how can there be more?" "Because," said Mrs. May, "there is more. A lot more." Kate glared at her. "All right," she said. "Go on." Mrs. May looked back at her. "Kate," she said after a moment, "stories never really end. They can go on and on and on. It's just that sometimes, at a certain point, one stops telling them." "But not at this kind of point," said Kate. "Well, thread your needle," said Mrs. May, "with gray wool this time, and we'll sew these squares together. I'll start at the top, you can start at the bottom. First a gray square, then an emerald, then a pink, and so on." "Then you didn't really mean it?" said Kate irritably, trying to push the folded wool through the narrow eye of the needle. "When you said he never saw them again?" "But I did mean it," said Mrs. May. "I'm telling you just what happened. He had to leave suddenly at the end of the week, because there was a boat for India and a family who could take him. And for the 3 days before he left, they kept him locked up in those 2 rooms. "For 3 days?" exclaimed Kate. "Yes, Mrs. Driver, it seemed, told Aunt Sophie that he had a cold. She was determined, you see, to keep him out of the way until she got rid of the borrowers." "And did she?" asked Kate. Did they all come, the policeman and the rat-catcher and the—" "The sanitary inspector didn't come, at least not while my brother was there. They didn't have the rat-catcher from the town hall, but they had the local man. The policeman came," Mrs. May laughed. "During those 3 days, Mrs. Driver used to give my brother a running commentary on what was going on below. She loved to grumble, and my brother, rendered harmless and shut away upstairs, became a kind of neutral. She used to bring him his meals. She used to bring his meals up, and on that first morning she brought all the doll's furniture on the breakfast tray and made my brother climb the shelves and put it back in the doll's house. It was then she told him about the policeman. Furious, he said she was." "Why?" asked Kate. "Because the policeman turned out to be Nellie Runker's son Ernie, a boy Mrs. Driver had chased many a time for stealing russet apples from a tree by the gate. A nasty, thieving, good-for-nothing dribbit of no good, she told my brother. Sitting down there he is now in the kitchen, large as life, with his notebook out, laughing fit to burst. 21, he says he is now, and as cheeky as you make 'em." "And was he?" asked Kate, round-eyed. "A dribbit of no good? Of course not, any more than my brother was. Ernie Runker was a fine, upstanding young man, and a credit to the police force. And he did not actually laugh at Mrs. Driver when she told him her story, But he gave her what Cranfurl spoke of afterwards as an old-fashioned look, when she described homily in bed. "Take more water with it," it seemed to say. "More water with what?" asked Kate. "The fine old pale Madeira, I suppose," said Mrs. May, and great Aunt Sophie had the same suspicion. She was furious when she heard that Mrs. Driver had seen several little people when she herself, on a full decanter, had only risen to one or two, at most two. Cranfurl had to bring up all the Madeira up from the cellar and stack the cases against a wall in the corner of Aunt Sophie's bedroom, where, as she said, she could keep an eye on it. "Did they get a cat?" asked Kate. "Yes, they did, but that wasn't much success either. It was Cranfurl's cat, a large yellow Tom with white streaks in it. According to Mrs. Driver, it had only two ideas in its head, to get out of the house or into the larder. Talk of borrowers," Mrs. Driver would say as she slammed down the fish pie for my brother's luncheon. "That cat's a borrower, if ever there was one. Borrowed the fish, that cat did, and a good half-bowl of egg sauce." But the cat wasn't there long. The first thing the rat-catcher's terrier did was to chase it out of the house. There was a dreadful set, too, my brother said. They chased it in everywhere, upstairs and downstairs, in and out all the rooms, barking their heads off. The last glimpse my brother had of the cat was streaking through the spinney and across the fields with the terrier after it. "Did they catch it?" "No," Mrs. May laughed. "It was still there when I went a year later. A little morose, but fit as a fiddle." "Tell about when you went." "Oh, I wasn't there long," said Mrs. May, rather hastily. "And after that the house was sold. My brother never went back." Kate stared at her suspiciously, pressing her needle against the center of her lower lip. "So they never caught the little people?" she said at last. Mrs. May's eyes flickered away. "No, they never actually caught them, but," she hesitated, "as far as my poor brother was concerned, what they did do seemed even worse." "What did they do?" Mrs. May laid down her work and stared for a moment thoughtfully at her idle hands. "I hated the rat-catcher," she said suddenly. "Why? Did you know him?" "Everybody knew him. He was a walleye, and his name was Rich William. He was also the pig killer, and, well, he did other things as well. He had a gun, a hatchet, a spade, a pickaxe, a contraption with bellows for smoking things out. I don't know what the smoke was exactly, poison fumes or some kind of which he'd made himself from herbs and chemicals. I only remember the smell of it. It clung round the barns or wherever he'd been. You can imagine what my brother felt on that third day, the day he was leaving, when suddenly he smelled that. He was all dressed and ready to go. The bags were packed. And in the hall, Mrs. Driver came and unlocked the door and took him down the passage to Aunt Sophie. He stood there, stiff and pale, in gloves and overcoat, beside the curtained bed. "Seasick already?" Aunt Sophie mocked him, peering down at him over the edge of the great mattress. "No, he said, it's that smell." Aunt Sophie lifted her nose. She sniffed. "What smell is it, Driver?" "It's the rat-catcher, my lady," explained Mrs. Driver, reddening, "down in the kitchen." "What?" exclaimed Aunt Sophie. "Are you smoking them out?" And she began to laugh. "Oh, dear! Oh, dear!" she gasped. "But if you don't like them, Driver, the remedy's simple." "What is that, my lady?" asked Mrs. Driver coldly, but even her chins were red. Helpless with mirth, Aunt Sophie waved a ringed hand toward her, her eyes screwed up and her shoulders shaking. "Keep the bottle corked," she managed at last, and motioned them weakly away. They heard her laughing still as they went down the stairs. "She don't believe in them," muttered Mrs. Driver, and she tightened her grip on my brother's arm. "More fool her. She'll change her tune like enough when I take them up afterwards, laid out in seizes on a clean piece of newspaper," and she dragged him roughly across the hall. The clock had been moved, exposing the wainscoting, and as my brother saw at once, the hole had been blocked and sealed. The front door was open as usual, and the sunshine streamed in. The bag stood there beside the fiber mat, cooking a little in the golden warmth. The fruit trees beyond the bank had shed their petals, and were lit with tender green, transparent in the sunlight. "Plenty of time," said Mrs. Driver, glancing up at the clock. "Cab's not due till 3:30. "The clock stopped," said my brother. Mrs. Driver turned. She was wearing her hat and her best black coat, ready to take him to the station. She looked strange and tight and chapel-going, not a bit like Driver. "So it has," she said. Her jaw dropped, and her cheeks became heavy and pendulous. "It's moving she decided, after a moment. "It'll be all right," she went on, "once we get it back. Mr. Frith comes on Monday." And she dragged again at his arm above the elbow. "Where are we going?" he asked, holding back. "Along to the kitchen. We've got a good 10 minutes. Don't you want to see them caught?" "No," he said, "no," and pulled away from her. Mrs. Driver stared at him, smiling a little. "I do," she said. "I'd like to see 'em close. He puffs this stuff in, and they come running out. At least, that's how it works with rats. But at first he says you block up all the exits," and her eyes followed his to the hole below the wainscot. "How did they find it?" the boy asked. Puttied it looked, so they put some stuff over it, and with a square of brown paper pasted on crooked. "Rich William found it. That's his job." They could unstick that," said the boy after a moment. Mrs. Driver laughed. "Oh, no, they couldn't. Cemented, that is. A great block of it, right inside, with a sheet of iron across from the front of the old stove in the outhouse. He and Crampfurl had to have the morning-room floor up to get at it. All Tuesday they was working, up till tea-time. We aren't going to have no more capers of that kind, not under the clock. Once you get that clock back, it can't be moved again in a hurry. Not if you want it to keep time. It can't. See where it stood, where the floor's washed away like? It was then my brother saw, for the first time, and last time, that raised platform of unscrubbed stone. "Come on now," said Mrs. Driver, and took him by the arm. "We'll hear the cab from the kitchen." But the kitchen, as she dragged him past the baize door, seemed a babel of sound. No approaching cab could be heard. What with the yelps and barks and stampings and excited voices, "Steady, steady, 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 steady," Crampfurl was saying on one loud note as he held back the rat-catcher's terriers, which shrilled and panted on the leash. The policeman was there, Nellie Runker's son Ernie. He had come out of interest, and stood back from the others a little, in view of his calling, with a cup of tea in his hand and his helmet pushed off his forehead. But his face was pink with a boyish excitement, and he stirred the teaspoon round and round. "Seeing's believing," he said cheerfully to Mrs. Driver when he saw her come in at the door. A boy from the village was there with a ferret. It kept sort of pouring out of his pocket, my brother said, and the boy kept pushing it back. Rich William himself was crouched on the floor by the hole. He had lighted something beneath a piece of sacking, and the stench of it, smoldering, eddied out about the room. He was working the bellows now, with infinite care, stooping over them, rapt and tense. My brother stood there as though in a dream. Perhaps it was a dream, he said to me later, much later, after we were all grown up. He gazed round the room. He saw the sunlit fruit trees through the window, and a bough of the cherry tree which stood upon the bank. He saw the empty teacups on the table, with spoons stuck in them, and the one without a saucer he saw, propped against the wall, close beside the baize door. The rat-catcher's belongings, a frayed coat, patched with leather, a bundle of rabbit snares, 2 sacks, a spade, a gun, and a pickaxe. "Stand by now," Rich William was saying. Okay, so here we have everybody in the kitchen. So there's the rat catcher, right? Here's Cramp Furl with the dogs. This is the bellows that he's pumping the smoke inside the borrower's hole. There's just some boy from town with his ferret. Here we have Police Officer Ernie, and then Mrs. Driver, and then the little boy. Oh my goodness. There was a rising note of excitement in his voice, but he did not turn his head. "Stand by, ready now to slip the dogs." Mrs. Driver let go my brother's arm and moved toward the hole. "Keep back," said the rat catcher, without turning. "Give us room." And Mrs. Driver backed nervously toward the table. She put a chair beside it and half raised one knee, but lowered it again when she caught Ernie Runker's mocking glance. "All right, Ma," he said, cocking one eyebrow. "We'll give you a leg up when the time comes." And Mrs. Driver threw him a furious look. She snatched up the 3 cups from the table and stumped away with them, angrily, into the scullery. Seamless smutch of something or other, my brother heard her mother mutter as she brushed past him, and at those words suddenly my brother came to life. He threw a quick glance about the kitchen. The men were absorbed. All eyes were on the rat catcher, except those of the village boy, who was getting out his ferret. Stealthily, my brother drew off his gloves and began to move backwards, slowly, toward the green baize door. As he moved, gently stuffing his gloves into his pocket, he kept his eyes on the group around the hole. He paused a moment beside the rat catcher's tools and stretched out a wary, groping hand. His fingers closed at last on a wooden handle. Smooth it was, and worn with wear. He glanced down quickly to make sure. Yes, it was, as he hoped, the pickaxe. He leaned back a little and pushed, almost imperceptibly, against the door with his shoulders. It opened sweetly in its silent way. Not one of the men had looked up. "Steady now," the rat catcher was saying, stooping closely over the bellows. "It takes a moment like to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor." My brother slid through the barely open door, and it sighed to behind him, closing out the noise. He took a few steps on tiptoe down the dark kitchen passage, and then he ran. There was the hall again, steeped in sunshine, with his bags beside the door. He bumped against the clock, and it struck a note, a trembling note, urgent and deep. He raised the pickaxe to the height of his shoulder and aimed a sideways blow at the hole below the wainscoting. The paper tore, a few crumbs of plaster fell out, and the pickaxe rebounded sharply, jarring his hands. There was indeed iron behind the cement, something immovable. Again he struck, and again. The wainscot above the hole became split and scratched, and the paper hung down in strips, but still the pickaxe bounced. It was no good. His hands, wet with sweat, were sliding and slipping on the wood. He paused for breath, and looking out, he saw the cab. He saw it on the road beyond the hedge, on the far side of the orchard. Soon it would reach the russet apple tree beside the gate. Soon it would turn into the drive. He glanced up at the clock. It was ticking steadily, the result, perhaps, of his knock. The sound gave him comfort and steadied his thumping heart. Time, that's what he needed. A little more time. "It takes a moment, like," the rat catcher had said, "to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor." Ventilation. That was the word, the saving word. Pickaxe in hand, my brother ran out the door. He stumbled once on the gravel path and nearly fell. The pickaxe handle came up and struck him with a sharp blow on the temple. Already, when he reached it, a thin filament of smoke was eddying out of the grating, and he thought, as he ran toward it, that there was a flicker of movement against the darkness between the bars. That was where they would be, of course, to get the air. But he did not stop to make sure. Already he heard behind him the crunch of wheels on the gravel, and the sound of the horse's hooves. He was not, as I have told you, a very strong little boy, and he was only 9, not 10 as he boasted to Arrietty. But with 2 great blows on the brickwork, he dislodged one end of the grating. It fell down sideways, slightly on a slant, hanging, it seemed, by one nail. Then he clambered on the bank and threw the pickaxe with all his might into the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He remembered thinking as he stumbled back, sweaty and breathless, towards the cab, how that, too, the loss of the pickaxe, would cause its own kind of trouble later. Ooh. So he broke the grating that was on the outside of the house to maybe help the borrowers escape from this terrible, terrible situation. Oh my goodness, they definitely don't want to come out here. They're going to get caught. So hopefully he's helped them escape. I guess we'll find out next time in our very last chapter, Chapter 20. All right, guys, see you next time. Bye!